How many stars are there? Is the Trinity mentioned in the Jewish Bible? And what can we learn from the 10 plagues? This is Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and you're listening to Jews Did It First.
You are my life, my length of days. You are the rhythm in my veins. My heart pulses to your name. I rise from sleep and speak your praise.
Thank you so much for tuning in. And please subscribe and leave a review on your Apple iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast. Also, if you'd like to donate to help contribute to the podcast, please go to jewisoswego.org/JewsDidItFirst and click on the Make a Donation button in the upper right-hand corner. I'm going to spend the next few weeks talking about science. Generally speaking, when we think of science in the ancient world, we don't put too much stock into it. And that's true with Judaism as well. And this is for two main reasons. One, the ancients had very limited scientific knowledge. The truth is we also have very limited scientific knowledge. We just know what they didn't know thousands of years ago. And can you imagine what we don't know when you compare us to people thousands of years from now? The second is evolution. I'm not talking about origin of species type evolution. I'm talking more about microevolution. Minor changes within species and the environment over a relatively short period of time. In the world of Jewish law and literature, we would say nishtana teva ha'adam, the change in nature or the constitution of people. Loosely translated, things change. What may have been a good medical remedy 2,000 or 3,000 years ago may not be so impactful nowadays. Our environment changes, our body chemistry changes. Not much, if anything, in this world is static. However, with all of that said, there are quite a few examples of scientific knowledge that's proposed in the Talmud and other ancient Jewish literature that modern science has just recently caught up with. And we could reasonably say, Jews did it first. Today I want to talk about something quite fascinating, and that's the number of stars in the universe. And I find it fascinating for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's no way to really know with any real accuracy unless you're God. We can only see a very small sliver of the sky, even with our powerful telescopes and worldwide connections giving us a continuous 360-degree view of space. We can only see about 4% of the known universe. And when you look up in the night sky, you're only able to see about 2,500 to 5,000 stars. The second reason I find it fascinating is that numbers as high as we'll be speaking of were not really thought of in the ancient world. I don't mean unheard of, I mean unthought of in antiquity. In fact, the history of numbers and counting is really quite interesting. You should look it up sometime. Even in Judaism, it's hard to express numbers beyond tens or hundreds of thousands. You'd have to start combining things, and it just wasn't really done. An interesting exception to this was ancient India, but that's an outlier. So, how many stars are there? Perhaps the most famous ancient astronomer was Hipparchus. I think that's how you pronounce his name. If it's not, I'm sorry. Anyway, Hipparchus, a Greek guy, lived during the 2nd century BCE. He placed the position of over 1,000 stars, but I couldn't really find any mention of him guessing as to the total amount of stars he believed there to be. It seems that all we have with ancient cultures are whatever they catalogued, not really what they imagined or estimated there to be. But Rashi, interestingly enough, who's the quintessential biblical commentator of the 11th century, says in his commentary in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 10, that there are for sure over 600,000 stars, like it's a given thing. Well, why did he think that when at this time the most stars ever charted were a little over 1,000, maybe 1,100? And you can only see maybe a few thousand in the night sky. Well, modern science estimates that there is about 10 to the 24th power stars. That's one with 24 zeros after it. That's a lot of stars. Now, it's important to note that this is just a guess. It was made by a Dr. David Kornreich by assuming a rough estimate of about 100 billion stars in the Milky Way, which is our galaxy, and assuming another very rough estimate of about 10 trillion galaxies. and then multiplying. So we're not exactly talking hard science here, but it's as good a guess as any, I suppose. So what does Judaism say? Well, in Tractate Brachos of the Talmud, page 32, side B, the way that the Talmud works is each page has two sides, the front side and the back side, so A and B. So over there, it reads this paragraph. Reish Lakish said, now Reish Lakish was a rabbi, so don't worry about it. Okay, Reish Lakish said, the community of Israel said before the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the universe, when a man takes a second wife after his first, he still remembers the deeds of the first. You have both forsaken me and forgotten me. And the Holy One, blessed be he, answered her, my daughter, 12 constellations have I created in the firmament, and for each constellation I have created 30 hosts, and for each host I have created 30 legions, and for each legion I have created 30 cohorts, and for each cohort I have created 30 divisions, and for each division I have created 30 camps, and to each camp I have attached 365 thousands of myriads of stars, corresponding to the days of the solar year, and all of them I have created only for your sake. And you say that you have forgotten me and have forsaken me. Can a woman forsake her suckling child? Now, this is discussing how much God loves the Jews. But it's very detailed in its account of all these stars. So how much is that? Well, the numbers used here are basically references to Roman army units and battalions and stuff like this. But when you do the math, you end up with 1.064 times 10 to the 18th. That's also a lot of stars. Not only is it a pretty astounding number for antiquity, but it's kind of close to the number that modern scientists estimate thousands of years later. Now, if you know a little about math, you'll tell me, Rabbi, just because 24 minus 18 equals 6 doesn't mean that this is a close estimate. We're talking, to the 18th power or the 24th power. This is off by a factor of 1,000,000. That's true. It is a very big difference. But I also have to believe that the Torah is true and the rabbis were speaking with Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. These were incredible human beings, by the way. Many of these guys could raise the dead, speak with spirits and angels. They were not your ordinary pulpit rabbis here. They had a divine connection that none of us can fathom. An interesting story to illustrate the intellect of the sages is one of a rabbi in the Talmud, the name escapes me at the moment, who could count the leaves on a tree. By the way, how in the world would you know if he's right? Very simple. You take a few leaves off when he's not looking, and then you ask him again. Now, I like this story for two reasons. One, it's relevant to our counting topic, and two, it shows his greatness not with some fantastic story of conjuring spirits or talking to angels or raising the dead, but with something to which an everyday person can relate. Counting. So, I have some theories as to this discrepancy in the number of stars between what science says and what the Torah says. And some of these theories, validate both. Number one, science is just giving an estimate. So why should we even give the number so much credence in the first place? It could be radically off. But I don't like to just discard scientific analysis out of hand. So that's why I have some other theories as well. By the way, there could be less stars in the Milky Way. There could be galaxies with less stars. There's a lot of things that could change this number here. But anyway, number two. And this one I like the best, actually. I think it's probably the most powerful argument that aligns the two. The Torah, the Talmud specifically, is only speaking about the 12 constellations. If you go back to that quote, it says that, my daughter, 12 constellations have I created, and then it goes on, and those constellations have this and that and the cohorts and all that. Okay? So there's obviously more stars in the universe than are just in those 12 constellations. So that could mean that clearly both could be just as correct. In the Torah, we're just talking about the constellations, and scientific community is talking about all the stars in the universe in total. In addition, there's an estimated 150 billion stars per year being born. in various nebulae. That's a lot of new stars over 2,000 years. It's about 300 trillion to be exact. Number 4, another theory. I'm reminded of a Star Trek Voyager episode. I know it sounds silly, but okay, whatever. Just go with me here. Where they actually run into this area of space where there's no visible stars. If you're a Trekker or a Trekkie, you'll probably remember this episode. So, there could be pockets of like this around the universe where there's just no stars visible. There's no stars there. And so we wouldn't know that because we can't really see, like I said, 96% of the universe. So you've got all these stars being born, and you've got stars, places in space where maybe there are no stars and we just don't know. So I personally think it's a combination of a lot of these factors. Like I said, especially the second theory, that the Talmud in this section is just speaking about the 12 constellations. It's not really giving a definitive number of the stars in the universe, but it's really the only thing in antiquity or in history that we see a decent estimate of the amount of stars there are in the universe, dealing with just the constellations, and then coming fairly close to the estimated amount of stars that we can determine in the entire known universe. So therefore, I feel pretty confident in saying that when it comes to accurately estimating the number of stars, Jews did it first. So I've been thinking. I mentioned last week, or maybe the week before, that pretty soon I'm going to end the counter-missionary segment of the program, mostly because there's only so many proof texts that missionaries use. There are missionary responses to many of the arguments I've made, but to delve into them and then give the response to those responses, I feel that's getting a little too polemical, and that's not really the purpose of this podcast. Therefore, in another 5 or 6 weeks, I'll be switching to controversial issues. Things that Judaism discusses hundreds or even thousands of years ago that can help frame many of our current political, scientific, and moral debates in a Jewish context. Besides, it really fits with the theme of Jews did it first. We've been thinking about these issues for millennia, and my wife likes the idea, so she wins. And now, the counter-missionary. Okay, there's a very big difference between Judaism and Christianity that goes beyond whether or not we think Jesus is the Messiah. There's actually a major theological difference between us. That's the Trinity. Now, this rift mostly exists because of how each side views the nature of the Messiah himself, which I discussed a few weeks ago. You can go back to the episode from late December for that discussion. I think it was entitled The Messiah. Truthfully, I'm not bothered so much by Christians believing in the Trinity. And to be clear, it's considered against the concept of God's unity according to Judaism. It's contrary to our monotheistic core. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's pure idolatry for non-Jews. So that's not what this is really about. Lots of religions believe in things that Judaism rejects for Jews, but doesn't prohibit for non-Jews. What this is about is the use by missionaries of the Jewish Bible itself to show the Trinity to the Jews. And there are 3 main verses in the Torah that missionaries use, and we'll briefly take a look at them. The first 2 are found right in the beginning of the Bible. In fact, the first one is the 3rd word in the original Hebrew. That is the word Elohim. Now, officially, it's Elohim, but we don't want to say the name of God, so I'll be saying Elohim just as a variation, but you'll know what I mean. Now, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the word used there for God is Elohim. Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. Now, if you know anything about Hebrew, you'll recognize that the word is plural. That's what the im at the end means. Therefore, they say, a reference to the Trinity. Now, this is really such a silly claim that even many mainstream Christian commentators themselves debunk it. The idea that Elohim being plural and therefore a reference to the Trinity is like saying that there are 3 Moseses. Moses himself is called Elohim, both with respect to Aaron in Exodus 4:16 and to Pharaoh in Exodus 7:1. A judge or an angel can also be called Elohim. In fact, the term really denotes judgment. And that's why Kabbalistically we say that when God is called by this term, it refers to his attribute of judgment or justice. Also, when it's used in the Bible, including the case to which we're referring here at the very opening of the Bible, the verbs that are around it are all conjugated in the singular despite the plural word. The second example, which is also in the beginning, is when God says, "Let us make man in our image." This also has a pretty simplistic response, right? Now it says us and our, so this kind of conjures up this idea of more than one person over here. But in fact, there's even more than one answer. One answer is that it's a sense of royalty or importance. In Hebrew, like many languages, when you speak about or to a monarch or some other formal setting, or when a monarch speaks of themselves, they use the plural form. You know, the old "we are not amused" line, purportedly to come from Queen Victoria. Another answer, and the one that's more commonly attested to in rabbinic literature, is that God was speaking to his heavenly court, the angels and such. Remember, man was the last thing created, so God has all of creation to converse with. As the Midrash relates, he took counsel with the heavenly beings because he didn't want there to be envy on earth, because there were things on earth, or there were no things on earth that were created in God's likeness, as you had among the heavenly beings, the angels. The Midrash also relates that even though this will give room for people to claim, as we see missionaries do, that this indicates more to God than utter unity, God put it in anyway, since it was so important to show us proper humility, that a great person should consult with and receive permission from a smaller one. And by the way, we see this concept of God conversing with this heavenly court in places like 1 Kings chapter 22, as well as Daniel chapter 4. You can look over there. It's pretty clear. Now, the last major verse that missionaries use jumps all the way to the end of the Torah. And you'll never believe which verse. The Shema itself. That's right. The quintessential verse expressing the oneness of God, they say shows the Trinity. That verse is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. How do they do that? Well, they say that one means not like one entity, but one thing made up of many parts. Like one bunch of grapes, for example. You have a bunch of little grapes make up one bunch. Or one table has parts. One table has legs and a top, and there's different parts to things. So too, they say God is one, but that means made up of parts. Namely, they say the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit or whatever. In fact, they'll continue, that's why God's name is mentioned 3 times in this verse. 3 times God mentioned, talking about one, so therefore Trinity, 3 is one and all that. Now, it is true that one can mean what they say, made up of parts. But, just like in English, one can also mean, just one. Part of the problem is that there's really nothing in the universe that is a pure singularity. Everything is made up of parts. That's probably why the Bible reiterates at least over 30 times the oneness of God. It's a tough concept to grasp, since we don't really have a reference for it in the physical universe. Lucky for God, he's not part of the universe, but completely and infinitely beyond it. My point is that if Christians want to believe in the Trinity, I'm not knocking them for it. I'm not making any statements pertaining to the truth or falsehood of that belief. I'm merely stating that you can't use the Jewish Bible to show it. It seems like a uniquely Christian concept. Interestingly enough, there are Christians who claim that the Trinity isn't even in the New Testament. There's Unitarians and such. That's why the Council of Nicaea, in the year 325, had to make a declaration of the Trinity to make the point that the other Christian beliefs of a non-Trinitarian God are false. But that's a whole different discussion. So let's end off with a wonderful lesson of the 10 plagues. So in this week's Torah portion, which is the portion of Va'era, we discuss the first 7 plagues of the 10. And we're going to focus on the first 2. And the first 2 really give you that boost into turning your life around from negativity and bringing it towards positivity. How do you do that? Of course, negativity here means things that do not align with godliness or God's will, and positivity are those things that do. Now, the first 2 plagues deal with the Nile River. The Nile is water, it is cold, and the Nile also represents the idolatry of Egypt, as well as just the focus on nature and natural tendencies, right? In Egypt, water doesn't fall from the sky so much. The way that the nation was fed, the way that the nation was sustained, was through the Nile River. Okay, the difference being when rain's coming from above, you're looking up towards God. God's bringing the rain. You're looking at the Nile River, looking down towards the earth, looking at nature and natural processes. So how do you turn your attention away from the natural world towards the supernatural world, up towards God, towards goodness? The thing is, the first thing that's done is God tells Moses, turn the Nile River into blood. Water is something that's cold, indifferent. Blood is something that is warm, passionate. So you have to take that coldness and you have to have a passion. You have a coldness towards godliness, towards what is worshipped. And you have to turn that into a fire, into a passion, blood, something that's warm. Then it's time to unleash the frogs. Frogs are cold-blooded, right? So what happens? The frogs are jumping around into the bedrooms of the Egyptians, into the food of the Egyptians, into the palace of Egypt. So what happens? Each time those cold amphibians are jumping around, you're bringing coldness to those places, right? So now you've got a passion for godliness, but you need to cool down your passion for things that aren't godly. And so, into the palace, into the materialism of your life, into the bedroom, a representative of the morals of your life. Have a coldness for those loose morals, as it were. And into the ovens, into the food of the Egyptians, the cuisine. Don't be so excited about your bodily needs, your food. Oh, you go to the best restaurant or get the $200 sushi. That's not what's to be passionate about. And so, as you warm yourself up towards godliness, right? Create a fire, create a passion and a warmth for things that are godly. Then you cool down the things that you're passionate about that are not godly. As the Rebbe would often say, that it's not so much about turning away from evil. That, of course, you're not allowed to do things you're not allowed to do, of course. But if you fill your life and you fill your day with positivity, with goodness, with kindness, with mitzvahs, then the drive and sometimes just the plain time to do things that are not appropriate on their own seem to dissipate. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. And today is also a very special day. It's the Yortzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of the Chabad movement, the founder of the Chabad movement. So l'chaim, l'chaim, we should live after his example, and we should be true to ourselves, true to the Torah, and help our fellow Jew, and indeed our fellow man, turn towards godliness, towards goodness, towards kindness, and away from evil. I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to continue the conversation with me on Twitter at Oswego Rabbi, or you can email me at rabbi@jewishoswego.org, or contact on the Facebook page, Jews Did It First. Shabbat Shalom. Until next week.
Countless are your praise. You are the power that saves. Some days I take hours to pray, but even if my tongue was sweet and lips graceful, I would still be unable to praise you. I'm grateful. I promise to be loyal and faithful. I'll represent you. I won't disgrace you. Thank you for taking I blow a